started. So thank you all for being here and welcome to the Digital Dialogue series, Co-Learning to Build a Good Food System. If you would like to listen to this webinar in Spanish, please click the button at the bottom of your screen that looks like a little globe and select Spanish. My name is Molly Riordan. I'm the Good Food Purchasing Coordinator for the City of Philadelphia Department of Public Health in the Division of Chronic Disease and Injury Prevention, also known as Get Healthy Philly. At Get Healthy Philly, we believe that all people should live to their fullest potential in environments that allow them to grow and thrive, and that progress only happens when we treat all people with dignity, care, and respect. As part of its efforts, my department works toward creating a healthy, sustainable, and fair local food system, or what we call a good food economy, and acknowledge that dismantling systems of oppression is foundational to achieving our vision of a just food system. Tonight is the third in a series of 6 conversations with community and civic leaders whose work reimagines our food system in Philadelphia and in cities across the country to answer the question, what does it take to build a good food system for all right now at this point in time? These intercity digital dialogues showcase progress in developing a good food economy through anti-racist strategies and inspire all of us to envision and work toward an equitable food system. This series is a partnership with the Free Library of Philadelphia's Division of Cultural and Civic Engagement, and I'd like to thank my co-organizer, Susanna Erminska, exhibitions curator at the division. Susanna is managing technology tonight, so if you have any tech issues, you can contact her via the chat function. Funding for this series comes from the Sodium Reduction Communities Program grant from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, from the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, and from the Free Library. This event was originally scheduled for an in-person event at the Heim Center for Civic and Cultural Engagement at the library, which is providing for the Spanish interpretation tonight and every night during this series. Tonight we have the honor of speaking with some people who are working at one of the most critical and challenging parts of the good food economy, figuring out how to finance it. In a 2018 survey of food entrepreneurs performed by my department in partnership with the Economy League of Greater Philadelphia, the majority of respondents reported that personal savings were the primary means of financing their food businesses, followed by personal credit cards. Are there alternatives to putting food entrepreneurs at personal financial risk as we build this new food economy? Our speakers tonight understand that coming up with these alternatives is critical, not just to individual businesses, but to the future of the food sector. It's an idea that's been around for a while and sees new salience now. A decade ago, in his second edition of the book, Agenda for a New Economy, David Korten writes, "We humans are awakening to the reality that we are living beings who inhabit a finite living earth, to whose ways we must now adapt by creating economies that mimic the biosphere and its capacity for self-reliant local adaptation through cooperative self-organization. The transition to an economy suited to the realities of life on Earth poses significant creative challenges. It also presents an epic opportunity to get our priorities right, express our human capacity for creative innovation, and actualize humanity's long shared dream of a world of universal peace and prosperity." Tonight's speakers demonstrate that creative thinking through their powerful revisioning to support a new food economy, and it's my pleasure to introduce them to you. First, Mariela Cedeno is the Interim Executive Director of Mandela Partners in Oakland, California. For over a decade, Mariela has shaped strategies that increase access to opportunity and investment for community members, entrepreneurs, farmers, and values-aligned stakeholders cultivating our local economy and food system. As part of Mandela Partners' leadership team, she catalyzes the development of Mandela Partners' Economic Ventures Framework, Entrepreneurship Programming, and Community Capital Fund, which seeks to increase access to low-cost, relationship-driven capital. We'll find out more about what that means in a little bit. Mariela spent her career engaging with and advocating for under-resourced entrepreneurs, key in building thriving, sustainable, and healthy communities. She holds a BA in Economics and International Relations with honors from University of California, Davis, and a master's in Latin American development for Vanderbilt University. Brett Malone has served as the Director of Lending at California FarmLink since July of 2014. Brett has previously served as loan officer since July of 2013, after serving as a member of California FarmLink's Board of Directors and Loan Committee. Brett has more than 15 years of experience supporting businesses across business success for farmers and leading nonprofit organizations that serve farmers. He's an adjunct instructor of sustainable agriculture at the Monterey Institute for International Studies. Brett has extensive nonprofit management experience and served as executive director of Friends of Mar Viva Foundation, as the executive director of ALBA, Agriculture and Land-Based Training Association in Salinas, California. Brett has a BA in International Relations, Business, and Spanish from the University of San Diego, and a master's in International Environmental Policy from the Monterey Institute of International Studies. And Molly Hartman, who's the program director for Healthy Food Financing Initiative at the Reinvestment Fund, a national initiative to improve access to healthy food in underserved rural and urban areas, to create and preserve quality jobs, and to revitalize low-income communities. She also leads the Philadelphia Food Justice Initiative, a partnership with the Philadelphia Department of Public Health. Previously, she was senior advisor for food policy in the mayor's office of the mayor in New York City. She earned her master's in public policy from the University of Southern California and a bachelor's from Wesleyan University. Welcome to each of you. I'm so glad that you can be here. I'm going to start with a question to Mariela, and I'm going to ask you something that you're probably used to hearing a lot or answering a lot. Can you tell us about Mandela Partners, what it does, what it's done before COVID, what it's maybe doing now, and how does what you do lead you to think differently about financing?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Lovely to meet you. Mariela here from the Bay Area in California. So Mandela Partners is a nonprofit organization. The nexus of our work is how do we connect both food access and economic development in a way that builds thriving communities. And as it relates to this conversation, what I'll share is that the main kind of pulse behind our work is facilitating a local food system. So we work with a network of regional farmers. We have an in-house produce distribution center that serves partially our food access programming, as well as other community retailers and community institutions. And within all that context, we also provide business development support to local entrepreneurs. I think, the work around food access and economic development was needed before COVID, and I think has become even more important, during COVID. It's not really yet after COVID. And what we saw really was that the folks who were being most impacted, health-wise, economy-wise by COVID were BIPOC communities that we were created to serve. And so from a programming perspective, I think what that shifted was the way that programming was deployed. Just to give an example, one of the programs that we hold is called, they're community produce stands. We run kind of like mini farmers markets at schools, health centers, community centers, affordable housing apartments. And without that connection of like people to people that obviously COVID has created, we really pivoted those programs to emergency food. And in a way that specifically uplifted our farmer network. We were seeing a lot of kind of like food-based response connecting largely here to agribusiness, and saw this kind of gap or opportunity to really make sure that the folks who were most needing access to both the resources, the food resources, but also the economic resources were included. And so part of our work was to uplift our local farm network and then connect that to our distribution sites. I think it's a hard question to answer because we're still in it. And I think especially in the entrepreneurship side, it feels really nebulous. I think given where we come from as an organization, like our core is to be responsive to needs, and we're still trying to navigate that. And so a lot of that has been around how do we support folks in continuing to generate sales as the economy and specifically small businesses are impacted. And then obviously making food available. And that's again, through our free produce distribution sites. And also now with a growing community meals program, where we are leveraging, again, local BIPOC owned businesses and connecting them to distribution sites. So yeah, and I have a lot of feelings around how COVID has impacted our work, but I think more importantly, our community. And I think it's really kind of like unearthed and put on the table this reality that we already knew, right? That specifically communities of color, limited resource communities already know, which is that when things, when things like this happen, we are the most likely to be impacted by those things. And we're seeing that play out. I think specifically to this question of financing or the finance world, and I'll share that relative to Mandela. We're a nonprofit. We didn't really come into this with the idea of getting into lending, but got into lending because part of our model, our systems-based model is really founded on how do we build upon local assets. So really shifting from a deficit framework that's often like put on our communities to a asset framework. What's available? How do we resource it? How do we provide technical assistance to help it flourish? And in that space is where we really got more into this lending financing space, because we were finding these great projects, these great businesses, these great initiatives that when, rubber hit the road around capitalizing them, we were dealing with lack of access to financing mechanisms. And our organization was established in 2004. Our work started in the late 1990s. And though a lot has changed in the sense of, more mission-aligned capital, we still find these barriers to be pretty significant. And so we've tried to figure out within our own capacity, how do we connect? How do we create our own funds that are democratically controlled? How do we connect with mission-aligned CDFIs or other sources of capital? And then also, how do we leverage grants and other kinds of other financial mechanisms to really reinvest in our neighborhoods? So, and I can share more once we hear more from Brett and Molly.
Brilliant, thank you. And you brought up something that I would like to ask you all later, but I'll hold off for now and give Brett a chance to speak. Brett, I know the partnership that you have with Mandela Partners is maybe a little bit different from your typical work at California FarmLink, and I'm wondering if you can share more about your work and what makes the collaboration with Mandela Partners and their work so unique.
Absolutely. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and be speaking alongside Mariela and Molly. So California FarmLink, we are a part of what we are is a community development financial institution, a CDFI, but we're much more than that as well. We were founded in 1999 and somewhat maybe similar to what Mandela Partners experienced, but from a slightly different perspective. We saw that there was a real gap in how beginning farmers and farmers of color were accessing capital, but we really didn't go down that path immediately. We were focused on access to land and secure land tenure. In terms of the partnership with Mandela and what's so unique about it, I think I'm going to talk about this when we get to a couple of the other discussion questions, but I think being able to, and we see this in our work generally, but its expression with Mandela is unique in that we're each have an important role to play in supporting the farmer's success. And so Mandela is approaching us with a farmer that they've already worked with, that they know they're a good producer, that they have a market, and that we can share the risk of making that loan together. And so the way kind of those elements of a partnership in lending gets expressed in different ways, in the way that FarmLink lends, which can include government guarantees and doing co-lending with other CDFIs and working with other organizations that provide technical assistance to farmers. So just the idea of that wraparound support and capital is really critical to the way that we work.
Thank you. And it would be great if at some point, and maybe Mariela and Brett, you could tag in on this and describe like exactly how things happen, because when I learned about it, that's one of the most exciting one of the most exciting initiatives I've seen, but I'll turn to Molly and let her introduce her work. And Molly, I know that you work with a different set of folks on the food supply chain. And I'm wondering, hearing about Brett describe the work of California Farm Link, if you could compare it to your work at Reinvestment Fund, and tell us a little bit more about specifically the Healthy Food Financing Initiative.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me. Hello to everyone. My name is Molly Hartman. I work at Reinvestment Fund. Reinvestment Fund is a community development financial institution like California Farm Link. We were founded in Philadelphia 35 years ago, and we work locally, regionally, and nationally. We have a range of programs and financial tools, including data analysis, policy advocacy work, lending, grants, technical assistance, and other work. And we have, for over 15 years, worked in food and food financing, beginning with our effort in partnership with the Food Trust and the Philadelphia Urban Affairs Coalition to launch the Pennsylvania Fresh Food Financing Initiative. Like California Farm Link, we are a community development financial institution, meaning we're a lender, but we're a mission-based nonprofit lender. We are have typically in the food space worked in food retail, and initially that meant grocery stores. As a lender, we work on the larger side with facilities financing, so brick and mortar development, construction, equipment. Although in our food portfolio, that has certainly expanded to include a wide range of types of businesses, from the retail side and increasingly going sort of up the supply chain to distribution, food hubs, and other food enterprises. We've also done some work in emergency food and child nutrition. In addition to our lending work, Reinvestment Fund is increasingly focusing on programs and public-private partnerships. And I lead two programs in food that are complementary to our lending work. We partner with the USDA to manage the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, which is the result of over a decade of work and advocacy along with partners, including Mandela, to advocate for a national response to inequities in access to affordable, healthy food at retail stores. In addition to funds for CDFIs to make loans, beginning in 2017, the USDA has had a Healthy Food Financing Initiative, and we administer that currently as a grants and technical assistance program. Those grants go directly to projects that, for the most part, need grant funding or technical assistance either before they're ready for debt or in addition to debt in order to make the project feasible. And that's something I can talk more about as we go along. And starting last year, we began partnering with the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, Get Healthy Philly, Molly's division, to administer the Philadelphia Food Justice Initiative, which is a new and really exciting program focusing on BIPOC organizations and businesses in Philadelphia that are focused on systemic issues in food and food justice in their own communities.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm so glad to have the breadth of experience across the food supply chain and the different entry points into thinking about capitalizing good food. So I appreciate it. And I've got a question for any of you just to kick it off. And I'm excited to hear how you think about this kind of conundrum. we know that financing food businesses is considered risky. Can you articulate any risks as you've seen them or experienced them, or answer or give an idea about what makes it easier to say yes to supporting a food business when they're coming at you for capital or for involvement in one of your programs? Anyone can take that.
I can share a bit, maybe less from the lending side, but more of maybe our end as a, I don't really know, we're not really a borrower either, but you know, I think for us, like our focus is really reinvesting in communities that have been disinvested from. And so our angle has never really been like risk or mitigating risk tolerance, but really like how do we get money back in our neighborhoods in a way that qualifies different things, different kinds of social impacts. And so just to give like two examples that I think are kind of relevant to your question, Molly, you know, the question of how our program works with FarmLink and Brett, I think was in response to this to some respect, right? Like how do we get money to farmers that may be perceived as risky, but also mitigate it based on our social relationship. So the way that program works is that we have, at this point, we've been buying produce for over a decade. We have an idea of how much we're going to buy from each farmer in a given year. And that's, you know, sales data from our programs or from, you know, sales data. And so we come up with a purchase order for the year, share that purchase order with FarmLink, share some of, you know, some contextual information about our relationship with the farmer that we've been working with. And then with the hopes that FarmLink then is able to advance the full amount of the purchase order to the farmer earlier in the season when they actually need the money, right? So this is like January, February, March, before we're really taking on produce like April through the end of the year. And so that money gets advanced to the farmer, and then the farmer drops off product at Mandela, right? So they're kind of paying back, for lack of better words, that loan in the commodity that they have, which is their produce. And then as we sell that product, we pay down the loan from FarmLink. And so that program specifically was created because a lot of the farmers that we were working with, though they fit in the demographic that FarmLink serves, were not necessarily comfortable with lending, but obviously had capital needs. And we had a specific relationship that we felt like was in, you know, maybe not in the financial metrics perspective, but was a risk mitigator, which is that we knew their product, we had a established relationship, we had a way of working with the farmer that really was based on trust. And this felt like a big gap. And so, you know, finding a CDFI partner like FarmLink that was willing to see those things as assets and mitigating their own risk and willing to test it out was a big part of how we think about making capital accessible in a way that maybe mitigates risk differently, but really with the end goal of not, for my end goal is not to mitigate risk for the lending community. Like my end goal is to make affordable financial tools accessible to the folks that we serve. So I think, you know, the relationship end of things is often underqualified in this world as we kind of distance ourselves from like the human contact of it. And I think because Mandela isn't an open lender, like we're not kind of like sales driven in that sense, that we're able to think of different ways to think about risk mitigation, to think about like originating loans. And so we often end up, though we do have our own like small loan fund, we often end up thinking about alternative ways of doing things with partners that are aligned mission-wise. So I think that's one thing that I'll just add to that. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on it.
Sure, I'll build on that a little bit. I think, you know, one of the things that we see with farm businesses in particular, but I think this, you know, goes for, you know, quote unquote, good food businesses as well, is that they really can be seen as social enterprises. I mean, they're providing benefits to society that aren't necessarily financial or being quantified financially, and those imply risks and costs to be borne by that business. And another characteristic is that many of them are startups. We talk to many, you know, aspiring farmers or very beginning farmers that are looking for capital, you know, along the lines of what Molly was saying in the introduction, you know, having to use their personal savings, or maybe they don't have much in the way of personal savings. And so, but maybe they have a lot of potential for, because of their work experience or life experience and what have you, or they've been through a training program and things. And so, these businesses that we work with are often classified as risky because of some of those characteristics that can also be looked at as strengths in many ways, I think. And so acknowledging the value that they bring and really having the mission to serve, a target group that is quote unquote disadvantaged in that way in terms of how they can access capital, I think allows us to do things that certainly a regulated financial institution wouldn't be able to do. But it's great to be able to work with other lenders, for instance, in doing co-lending with another CDFI that maybe doesn't work with farmers or wouldn't be willing to take on that risk, but knowing that we have the relationship and can manage that, puts them at ease, the other lender in that situation. And I think what I alluded to earlier around like integrated capital and wraparound support is really critical as well, because businesses such as these that have the disadvantages of these perceived risks associated with them, well, how can they be mitigated, or how can we address those so that they can be successful in spite of those or because of those? And so bringing in technical assistance partners, bringing in government guarantees or private guarantees and things like that have been ways that we've been able to address those risks. And we, through the relationship with Mandela, we've been able to develop relationships with a couple of other types of produce buyers and create kind of variations on this that has been really exciting as well, but in the same vein of sharing risk and having a shared goal of wanting to support the farmer because of each of the missions of the organizations involved. And so with the Harvest to Market program, what Mariela was describing as this partnership between Mandela and FarmLink puts money in the pockets of the farmer before they are going to plant, ideally, right? And I think some of our predecessors who were working on this before Mariela and I were working together on it described it as kind of an institutional CSA. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because there is risk shared, right, by, in this case, Mandela and FarmLink to support the farmer being able to produce what they're going to produce and know that there's a market there.
It seems like none of this happens overnight, if I'm hearing you correctly, right? This is about relationships and building up capacity internally over a long period of time. And I would assume having strong partners with great ideas like at Mandela, but also the willingness to kind of move this forward within your own institution, yes?
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah, I would just add to that, to both questions, I think. To echo what Brett said, the support for wraparound technical assistance for what we sort of broadly call pre-development in the field, I think is really, really key to making sure that entrepreneurs, borrowers, our grantees are really well prepared to move their project forward and be successful. That's our orientation to the work, is helping our projects be successful. If you think, knowing, like you said, Molly, that entrepreneurs put so much of their own personal capital into a project that, they're putting their own capital at risk to take something on. So, and, we work with a lot of food cooperatives also, retail food cooperatives, and they have a lot of member equity, funds from the community are put into starting the business. That's all at risk when a project is beginning. And so that's one of the things that we focus on with our grant programs is market studies, support with capacity building, community engagement, if that's a priority, or community ownership focus, trainings, and those kinds of services are one of the ways to help a project be successful. But that all requires resources, and there's a lot of capital for debt in a lot of cases, but less for technical assistance and operational costs. And that's sort of one of the key things is finding really willing funders and partners to help support that.
As a follow-up to that, and this is for anybody, is there an example of a project or program that you've supported that has turned out to be either more risky or even less risky? Maybe that's a good way of phrasing it than one might otherwise think. And if you can't give specifics, generals are interesting. I think what I'm interested in knowing is what qualities can you see that somebody who might be coming from a traditional debt financing point of view might not, qualities that they might not see or take into account?
I'll just add some thoughts. I mean, it's kind of hard, Molly, I think, for me to answer the questions in like the framing of risk, because I just don't think that's just how our brain works. But I do think, some of the ways that I think we try to support success are things that folks have mentioned, right? Which is technical assistance, like integrated capital. I think one of the big pieces that sits with me in these conversations is that often the way that we're thinking about things is really reinvesting in communities, right? So it's not kind of like an amorphous investment. It's really like money that's been extracted. And so how do we make it available again so that all the kind of economic fabric that had been thriving previously can like regrow and continue to thrive? I think from more of like the community development side of things, some of the ways that we've worked to support that is, and Brett, to your point, like, I think the idea that businesses that are also like mission driven can hold all the things and also function in a really capitalist system that's extracting all the time is like a bit absurd. And so thinking of how you capitalize those things is obvious. It's from our end is often different avenues, right? So it's like spending that pre-development time and figuring out what kind of technical resources folks might need to build their own skill set, to build their own capacity. It's looking for grants to make those things available as much as possible. It's looking for different kinds of investment vehicles that allows folks to like test. And then also like finally an investment that really allows the thing to grow. And I think, in various projects that we've had, we've seen this mix of things. So one of our first projects now more than 10 years ago was supporting residents who wanted to open a grocery co-op. And it was always independently owned and operated, like they're doing their own thing and they're thriving. I think they were very much perceived as risky. Like we looked to probably 12 different lenders to try to capitalize a project that said no to us. And the loan that we eventually got was terrible and actually like put the business in a worse position than without the loan. But it thrived, and it thrived because of the folks who were running the co-op. And our role really in that space had been multiple like versions of this. Like at first we were really the technical assistance provider, like helping with the legal side, with the training side, with all these things. And then when the project actually took off, it really was figuring out what this right mix of capital is to offset the costs of really the mission that they were holding, which to me is kind of like a human right government service. And then the business part of it, right? And so that package ended up being about 2/3 grant funded and about 1/3 debt funded, just to give like a number example. And I think that to me, like, was seen as a very risky project by like every single financial institution, even the one that eventually gave us the loan, and is a really wonderful example of community ownership and something that could thrive in a space that folks didn't think could. And I think that example is still relevant today, around many of the businesses that we work with, like from the farm to like the food retail side, and I think our role, like, which is really something that we need to hold, not folks who are already holding a lot, is like, how do we help them be successful? And so, and again, I think like the reality of that in a system that's like overly extractive is that can't always be debt. Like that shouldn't be debt. That shouldn't be 100% debt. So yeah, those are just my thoughts on that. I don't know if folks have adds.
I'll share something that I've been thinking about lately, both because of a project that we've been involved with, but also a project that's emerging that we're talking with folks about. And one of the things I think that we see because of the complexity of the challenges that we're dealing with in the food system and how they connect to other issues and communities, economics and social issues more broadly than the food system, is that projects often can be pretty complex, and folks can have a tendency to want to take on more than maybe they are able to or is feasible initially. And I think, balancing that vision with the practicalities of running an enterprise or enterprises that are aiming to, produce a product or provide a service or what have you, is really important. And so I think, from the entrepreneur's perspective, particularly ones that are trying to do, be a social enterprise and provide, benefits to society with whatever their business is to really think about it in a way that is going to be feasible in the near term and the medium term, and that there's time to take on more things. I mean, it's one thing to have a vision, but to try and take on more than you can handle early on, I think, can cause problems early on that could, challenge the success of what you're trying to do. So just really thinking about things in components, I think, and how they can fit together and happen over time is important.
Thank you both. And that's great, because I'm often thinking about how do we quantify the total value of a values-based initiative. And one of the things, and maybe Molly, if you want to speak about this at all, I think that the food justice initiative that we are working on in Philadelphia it's an opportunity to think a little bit more about how there can be fewer restrictions on the opportunity to fund some work. So Molly, maybe if you want to say a little bit more about how that program is kind of looking at the total value of what could be contributed to by a single project.
Absolutely. I think that one of the exciting things about the Philadelphia Food Justice Initiative is the opportunity to look at what success looks like for a project in a really different way. And it's a relatively small program compared to some of the larger loan funds that exist. But loans are a tool for projects that are ready to start generating income so they can repay debt. And as a grant fund, a pure grant fund at this point, we have the opportunity to invest and not expect a financial return from projects that may not be focused on generating income, like mutual aid, like community-based agriculture, and like some of our grantees in the first round, learning about a way to better serve their community with food. We've been supporting the exploration of a buying club by community residents in North Philly. And in West Philly, working with a group of students, a youth-led organization that is working on creating healthy food market opportunities focused on young people who live in neighborhoods that are swamped with unhealthy snack and food options. And both of those projects, were in a development stage. And so with grant funding, they were able to develop financials, they were able to pilot, they were able to do menu testing, they were able to explore suppliers, and the success of both of those grants was what they learned, was the engagement of residents or the engagement of the students, rather than the metrics of how many meals they served or how many square feet they were opening of a retail store, because they may be years away from that or may never seek to go in that direction.
And as you said before, the program is primarily focused on BIPOC members of the Philadelphia community, and I think it's probably the appropriate time to zoom out a little bit and look at that in context. So we know that people of color in the United States have faced centuries of discriminatory policies, and many of them are related to lending, finance, land ownership, that have prevented land and property ownership and inhibited wealth building opportunities. So right now, in this moment of racial reckoning, how can organizations like yours acknowledge and counteract this history and reinvest in BIPOC communities? Mariela, you already started describing it, and I appreciate that you said we don't want to focus on risk and on debt financing. It's about making a more affordable options available to capitalize great ideas. So I'm imagining that there's some other ways that you're thinking about how to do this through Mandala.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the mission of the work of Mandela. So it's something that we think about a lot. And I think especially now, I think COVID has made us think about it more, right? Just how lending serves a purpose in a specific purpose. But capital, like access to markets, like those kinds of opportunities need to be as uplifted, if not more right now. So I think that's something that we're thinking about a lot. And frankly, like I don't have a solution for today. So as it relates to COVID, I think it's something that we're still testing. I don't know if anybody has. I think, on the other side of things, what I'll share, kind of part of the bigger ecosystem that we sit with and thinking about a different way of accessing and making capital available. Mandela is a founding member of a collaborative called the Equitable Food Oriented Collaborative. And it's a collaborative of organizations throughout the country that are BIPOC led, that are really thinking about both like the holistic approach to community development, probably some sort of market-based strategy through that lens of food, in a way that's really representative of the communities that we're serving. And I think what's really come up in that and kind of in our peer network is thinking about who right now controls capital, right? And I think it's something that we talk a lot about. How do we like mitigate risk for lenders? How do we think about the pipelines differently? And I've seen kind of this shift and movement to thinking about really who holds the wealth, who's making decisions around where investments go. I think on two ends. One is really pushing back on folks who have built wealth on the backs of BIPOC communities now for centuries, to think about whether or not it's moral for them to get more wealth out of those same communities, and really trying to think about lenses that allow them to invest in a way that makes money available in communities, but doesn't necessarily provide a financial return, provides really like that social return to them. And I think on the other end is really how do we create more democratization of who owns the capital, of who runs these funds, of who's, you know, managing CDFIs. Because, you know, inevitably the way that you can really like build community voice is by having community voice make those decisions, right? And that looks different in different spaces, but I really think like that to me is where in you know, this lens of like the reality of the history of this country, that it's going to be very hard to do that without that being really present and upfront. Like one, which I, you know, in the kindest way possible, like I don't think that most of the wealth holders in this country need to be making more money, nor do I think that I should repay them for anything, me as an individual. And I can just like, you know, extrapolate that to other folks who might look like me. And two, that like we have a wealth of knowledge and resources, you know, that I think everybody's kind of elevated in this conversation and probably can make better decisions than other folks can. So I think that to me is where I hope things are shifting towards. And I see a lot of, you know, in our space, I see a lot of mission aligned CDFIs, including FarmLink, like really thinking about this, like both from the EDI lens, but just generally, like how do we make voice more present in decision making? And from the EFOD angle is really like about ownership and who's making these choices directly, right? Like how do we manage our own capital? How do we have these conversations with philanthropy, with family offices, with wealth holders to really say like, you know, your investments could look different. And if you really want to have this lens that you are kind of come, this reckoning that's come to you, they need to rethink about who's holding that money and where it's being invested. So yeah.
I can share a bit about where FarmLink is. Oh, it's not like there's an echo. No.
You're good, go for it.
Good. And yeah, I mean, I think what Mariela described, I mean, we are, I think, really trying to go down that path. I mean, FarmLink was founded and we got into lending because of that legacy that you described, Molly, of you know, extracting wealth and dispossessing BIPOC people of land over centuries. And we've, you know, been working on this for 20 years or so, and, you know, trying to find our way. And we're a white-led organization. We have several people from the communities that we serve working at FarmLink now, which is progress. But how do we get to a point where we have farmers and borrowers more involved in the governance of the organization and ideally involved in decision making around lending? I mean, we started a DEI process last year and are really kind of in the depth of looking at governance models that can allow us to move in that direction. So that's, you know, it's really exciting, but it's also daunting, and you know, it's work that needs to be done. I mean, the fact that, you know, 3/4 of the loans that we make go to BIPOC farmers is great, but that's not enough because it doesn't really speak to what the impact of that capital is and who's making those decisions and those types of factors. So, you know, we have a lot of work to do, but it definitely feels like we're asking the right questions. We're looking at other, you know, leaders in the field and how they're approaching these issues and what ways we can grow and learn. So it's the direction we have to go.
So go ahead, Molly.
Oh, I was just going to add, in particular, about the Philadelphia Food Justice Initiative, and we're really sort of grateful for the partnership and the vision of the Philadelphia Department of Public Health that set the stage for this. And you know, one of the priorities for that funding is to support BIPOC-led organizations working to address food challenges in their own neighborhoods. And one of the things in the framing of that program is, you know, for folks who have been doing the work for a long time but need funding to scale up or to sustain or grow some of their programming or start a new initiative. And I want to pull that in particular because other folks have talked about, you know, knowledge that's held by communities and moving away from sort of a service-based model, a model, you know, of serving a community that may have some saviorism, white saviorism in it, but instead about investing in community solutions and entrepreneurship.
Perfect. Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience that float along nicely. I'm not going to take them in order, but I am going to ask you all of them. So on kind of the flip side, Amanda asks if any of you see particular opportunities for divestment that can fund, divestment that can fund this type of investment. So are there opportunities to move away from that which we do not want to fund anymore and towards something that you all are working to fund?
I think all of us are having these conversations and could speak to this, but you know, obviously among philanthropy, there's this movement towards more PRIs, more, you know, the social return on investment. And so I think that that's sort of where this conversation is going. You know, Mariela and her peers are leading this, you know, conversation about what a return can look like for a typical investor when you look at what impact could be more than just financial return. And, you know, that's sort of where the concept of the CDFI came from, as Brett said, you know, and where we were founded, and a lot of CDFIs were founded. That's why reinvestment is in the name of our organization and others, because the idea was to divert funding from banks into communities that had been redlined. And we've, you know, come to a certain point, but could go even further. And I think the source of capital is really key to that.
Yeah, I was going to mention a few things. One is I think there's a lot of really cool and interesting funds that have popped up over the years that are really trying to get at this idea of democratizing wealth and who owns and makes those decisions. You know, there's like Boston GMA, there's the Black Farmer Fund, NDN Fund. Like there's just a lot of folks who are experimenting around what this looks like and providing investment opportunities for folks who are looking to divest from maybe what their, you know, standard might look like, with this like really upfront kind of like, this is what you're investing in, this is what you're getting into. I am you know, an advisory part of a fund here called the Olamina Fund that also does national lending, also thinking about this and really upfront about the racial lens that you're signing up for, the kinds of returns that you're getting, and not focusing necessarily, like talking about what the process for underwriting looks like, but not necessarily focusing on it as risk, but really as an imperative to divest and reinvest in something different. So those are, you know, I think those are like practical places where you can put your money if you have that. You know, like Molly mentioned, I think we've really been excited about philanthropy, and specifically philanthropic funders who are looking at spend downs, right? Who aren't looking at just kind of like perpetuating their wealth forever, but really spending down those things. Like here locally, we have Stupski is a spend down foundation, and I think that's been really I think the folks who are invested in that have been probably the most interesting to work with, because they're really looking at partnership and long-term sustainability, and really, I think, elevating community voice. And then just the last thing I was going to mention, there's someone named Namaka Agbo who writes, she's brilliant, and does a lot of work around restorative economics that I would just like plug in there to look at. And then also Common Future is an organization, also, you know, national, that's really been talking about this conversation around wealth, like who owns wealth, how you made wealth, and really like the realities of that, like really have like putting a mirror in front of wealth holders. I think in the sense of our own work, I think we're still trying to figure out like how do we continue to drive kind of this like integrated investment to projects, to entrepreneurs, to initiatives in a way that's sustainable, and in a way that like we're allowing folks to make those decisions. I think just one more thing I wanted to mention, which like may or not be related to anything, but it's been on the back of my head a lot. You know, like here in California, we're in the Bay Area, we're right next to tech, and I think one of the things that has always incensed me is how many kind of like tech founders like keep getting billions of dollars and bankrupting companies, and then like their 28th one is an expectation it's going to be some like unicorn Facebook. And there's these investors that are like willing to continue to put money into these, you know, into these people, into these initiatives, and also willing to let them fail, right? And I think like that's not something that our communities are ever allowed, right? Like the minute that somebody invests in a Black or Brown Indigenous project, if that project doesn't go well, like inevitably those folks are like, oh, look, we tried it, like it didn't work. Instead of giving like our communities really that chance to build that like entrepreneurial acumen that I think a lot of folks have had the capacity to do for, you know, hundreds of years. So that's like another thing that I think a lot about in this like risk mitigation, is that we actually like, there is value in allowing folks to try something and fail, right? Because the assumption is that the next time you try something, you're better informed, like, you know, what you could have done better, what didn't work. So I think like that's another space that I really see like a need for investment, right? Like this expectation that folks will have everything all together at once, I don't always think is realistic. You know, obviously we want folks to succeed. We want them to have that correct support, but I think also like retooling the way that folks expectations around success, like we're always really wary when we talk about, you know, our relationship, you know, the Harvest to Market program or our own loan fund, to talk about like our great repayment rate, because like, I don't know if that's really the indicator that we're trying to elevate in these conversations. Like the indicator that we're trying to elevate is really the investment of dollars and what those dollars did, and who those dollars served, not necessarily like whether that money came back to us. And often the way that we look at our own internal loan fund, which is very small, definitely in comparison to, you know, what Brett and Molly are holding, but, you know, we kind of look at it as money that we'd like to get back. But if we don't get it back, it's still like the right investment. And I know that we're kind of it's a privilege to be able to do that, in the sense that we've gotten grant money to be able to facilitate these things. But I think like that also, that lens is something that I think would be really impactful in this kind of like ecosystem of finance, is that we allow that same capacity of folks to try again, that we allow the rest of the more affluent world. So just an extra plug, side note.
Well taken, and thank you. I like the idea of redefining what success looks like and thinking about who is allowed to fail. You just got a dang, by the way, in the chat, so that's a good dang. It has a smiley face attached to it. So I'm going to ask another question, kind of following up on that in a way. And Mariela, you spoke about this a little bit earlier, but for each of you, one of the attendees is asking, like, what do you need more of? From your perspective, what are the one or two biggest barriers that you say have a decent odds of change, maybe, that you see preventing more of, sorry, I'm going to reread this question because we want to get it right. From your perspective, what are one or two of the biggest barriers that you see preventing more of the success your orgs want to see? like things that might be able to change. And we can think big here. We can think that systemic racism is going to change because it's not going to change if we don't make it. So like you can go that big if you want to, but are there things you need more of or barriers that you would see needing to change for any of your work?
I'll say one thing, which, we think about a lot. I think about a lot, working primarily in food retail. Food retail is only a piece of the broader food system, but most people get most of their food from the grocery store or a grocery store, and so it's this huge source of, it's this huge piece of the food economy. And on a store level, success looks like being able to cover your costs and pay your staff, continuing to operate and continuing to sell food to people, and we really, really hope that the stores can be successful in doing that. We hope they can, pay back their loans, pay their suppliers. But the amount of money that people have for food is this huge structural barrier. This was true before COVID. I'm really glad that a lot of people who have never struggled with food insecurity are suddenly looking at it. We are devastated to see the extent of it now and before and in the future. And so that's something that a store cannot control, is how many people are employed, what their income is. The SNAP benefits are insufficient. And so advocacy on income inequality and public benefits is a huge piece of the success of this industry.
Thinking big, and I'll just follow that with something big and maybe something smaller. Land redistribution, getting land in the hands of people that want to work it, that want to, make a living, feeding people and producing, other agricultural products. We need more of that. A lot of the farmers, small farmers and BIPOC farmers are, have very tenuous, precarious land tenure situations. So how that happens is another question. There are lots of efforts underway, but I think it's a huge, huge challenge that we face. And a smaller, smaller in the sense of maybe not as interesting, but I think equally as critical, because a lot of these food businesses are working with business models that are innovative, and many of them are startups. They need technical assistance, and I think that term gets overused. But whether it's a grant or a loan or convincing friends and family to invest in your business, being prepared for that ask and being confident that your plan is viable, that you're convinced of it, and you have the information there to convince yourself and others. It's a lot of work, and it's daunting for people that haven't done that before. And so in the farming space, we have a real challenge with farmers accessing the services of small business development centers, for instance. And there's definitely regional variation in that, but because most of the SBDCs work in urban areas and farms are in rural areas, that is a gap. And so how do we leverage the wealth of small business support that exist in the country and direct it to these types of businesses, I think is an important question.
Just to, echoing what folks have said, I definitely think that, access to technical resources is a big part of this. I think in like my selfish mind of just like Mandela and our team of 20 something folks, right? Like, I think having more capacity, which is obviously attached to resources, is something that we're always struggling with. Like, we know there's a need, we know there's a capacity and a want to serve, but like having human bodies that can do that is always something we run up against. And I'm sure all of you do. And, you know, I think the other piece that I've mentioned too is having more folks at the table. Like, I think that's something that needs to happen across the board in whatever way it can. 'Cause, you know, I just keep thinking like a lot of where we've gotten to has been because of these things that happen kind of in an ivory tower. And if we're really wanting to shift this, like folks who are the impacted, need to participate, like need to have a voice, need to be able to like own and run these things. And I think the other piece, just wanted to add to Molly, to your point, and I think sorry, I'm just like realizing there's a chat here that folks are putting stuff in, but you know, I think a lot around like the real cost of food, right? Like the cost that we have for food, which is already inaccessible for a large part of this country, is not even the real cost of food, right? Like if we really valued it. And so I'm often thinking what kinds of like government policies could support that gap. And, you know, just to share an example, in our small ecosystem, we are constantly balancing the idea of paying farmers a fair price and also making food affordable through our food access programs. And so some of the ways that we've been able to mitigate that is that we, have applied to FINI and CNIP, which are, you know, nutrition incentive programs, so that folks who are dealing with food access and are limited resource can get half off. And also we're able to pay farmers like the fair-ish price, because I'm sure it's not even that, for the product that they grow. So, you know, I'm not like a policy wonk, I'm not in this space, but I do think a lot about how like our economy right now is not real, right? It's like everybody's benchmarking against a number that's not actually real. And so if we really want to be able to support like our growers, our retailers, the workforce, that there has to be something in the middle that's subsidizing that, especially if we're also needing to make things affordable, right? Like I think, you know, just to Molly, your point around like right now folks having even less money to spend in grocery stores, like our food access programs were subsidized, but they were still paid. Like we don't operate like a food bank model, which is important and, you know, has its space, but that wasn't our model. But these last few months we have shifted to like free food in the sense of that, right? So like both a CSA program as well as our meal program, because that's the need. And when we were talking to our communities that, you know, for the last 15 years have paid some money, they were like, we're not in a place for any of this right now. And so we've had to really like shift the way that we deploy these programs, but it's also made us like, it's not sustainable forever, right? Like we've been able to do this right now because there's a lot of energy around COVID, and philanthropy, at least in our area, has really stepped up. But I see that kind of like wall, which is March for us, when people will kind of lose interest of this like thing that has been unpacked for folks who hadn't been previously impacted. Like all of these, everything loses energy at some point if like we don't sustain it. And so, you know, again, not a policy person, but it feels like this direct investment in food and food access needs to be like not just continued, but grown. And I think on the lending side, it's kind of, I have like a similar piece of that, right? Like the expectations that we're also reaping value from these businesses is always really hard for me, right? Even in getting like loans repaid. And so like, how do we continue to think of ways of investing both grant dollars as well as like, when they can, capital?
And Mariela, I think this must happen to you a lot. You're getting a lot of yeses and like yeses from the chat. So thank you. And this is maybe a point to leave it, because there is a presidential debate on this evening. Maybe this will come up. We could only hope that there would be this level of interest in how we are going to move forward a good food economy, but we are lucky that you three have been here with us this evening. Thank you. One thing that we're doing as part of this series is that we're putting together a resource page for people who are interested in learning more about anything that we've talked about. So for any of the panelists, if there are books, articles, people, really, you dropped a few names and we've already got them written down. Anything else that you think people should really know about as they're thinking about this piece of the good food economy, we'd love to be able to share those resources out. And so thank you to each of you for participating. Susanna, thank you for managing the tech side. And thank you to you all for being here. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with a discussion about how we remake a broken food supply chain. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.